40 years. In 40 years on the throne of Israel, not one curse ever reached Solomon. Witches tried. Enemy kingdoms with their own sorcerers tried. Foreign queens who slept inside his own palace, who prayed to their own gods at altars he had personally built for them, who placed objects beneath his own roof with the intention of pulling his power apart. They tried. Nothing touched him. Not because Solomon was naturally invincible, not because he was carrying some buried amulet or performing some secret ritual at dawn each morning, but because something sat beneath his throne, something placed there from the very beginning of his reign, that made it legally, spiritually, and covenantally impossible for any hostile force to enter his domain. Tonight, I want to show you exactly what it was. And then I want to show you what happened the moment it stopped working. Because the 40 years tell only half the story. The other half changes what you do tonight before you go to sleep. I have to tell you about a room in the British Museum. Room 9. The Assyrian collection. I was in my early 40s. This would have been sometime around 2009. And I had gone to look at the ivories. I was researching the decorative materials used on ancient Near Eastern thrones, specifically Solomon's throne, which 1 Kings chapter 10 describes in extraordinary detail. Ivory and gold, 6 steps, 12 lions, a footstool of pure gold. But what stopped me that afternoon wasn't the ivories. It was a photograph in a display case near the back of the room. A photograph of an excavation in Nineveh. An Assyrian king's throne platform, partially uncovered, and in the typed annotations beneath the photograph, a phrase that I had to read twice. Foundation deposits. Archaeologists had found, beneath the base of the throne, a sealed deposit of sacred objects, grain, a clay tablet with a dedicatory inscription, small quantities of burned offerings, and salt, small amounts of salt, sealed beneath the foundation at the moment of construction. The museum's explanation was clinical, archaeological. Foundation deposits were placed beneath important structures to invoke divine protection at the moment of building. But I didn't read it as archaeology. I read it as confirmation. Because 3 weeks earlier I had been sitting in Oxford with my hand on 2 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 5. And that text had done something to me that I was still processing. Let me read you that verse directly. 2 Chronicles chapter 13, verse 5. The Lord, the God of Israel, gave the kingship over Israel to David and his descendants forever by a covenant of salt. A covenant of salt. Not a covenant of blood, which is how most binding agreements in the ancient world were sealed. Not a covenant of fire or water or oil. Salt. I want you to understand what this meant in the ancient Hebrew world. Not as poetry, not as metaphor, as legal language. The Hebrew term is Brit Melach, covenant of salt. And in Hebraic law, a Brit Melach was the most permanent agreement that existed. More binding than a witnessed oath, more durable than a written contract. Why salt? Salt does not rot. Salt does not decay. Salt preserves everything it touches. It was the most stable substance the ancient world had access to. So stable that Roman soldiers were sometimes paid with it. The English word salary traces back to the Latin salarium, which referred to salt payments given to soldiers. Salt was currency, preservative, flavor, and law all in one. When the ancient Hebrews needed to say that something would last forever, that it would outlast kingdoms, outlast generations, outlast time itself, they said it was salt, and salt was present everywhere in Solomonic worship. Leviticus chapter 2, verse 13. Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all your offerings. Not optional. Not symbolic, legally required by divine command. Every sacrifice in Solomon's temple, every offering placed on the great bronze altar, every act of worship performed by every priest, every morning and every evening for 40 years, was salted. Not because it improved the flavor, because the covenant had to be materially present in every act of devotion. Numbers chapter 18, verse 19 repeats it again. The priestly portion of offerings is called a covenant of salt forever before the Lord. Forever. 3 witnesses. 3 different books of the law. All saying the same thing. Salt is what makes a covenant permanent. Now, the throne of Solomon. David's throne. The throne given to David's house by a covenant of salt in the first place, sat on top of that covenant. Not metaphorically. Literally, the salt was beneath the seat of divine authority. Take a moment to picture what Solomon's throne actually was. 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 18 through 20. Read it as architecture, not decoration. The king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with the finest gold. The throne had 6 steps, and the top of the throne was rounded in the back, and on each side of the seat were armrests and 2 lions standing beside the armrests, and 12 lions stood there on the 6 steps on the one side and on the other. 6 steps, 12 lions, ivory and gold. Every ancient Near Eastern king who received an ambassador in that throne room would have read the structure immediately. 6 steps corresponding to the 6 days of creation, 12 lions corresponding to the 12 tribes of Israel. A seat rounded at the crown to suggest the dome of heaven above the ruler's head. This was not furniture. This was a cosmological statement. When Solomon sat on that throne, he was not simply a man on a chair. He was sitting inside a covenant structure, a physical declaration that the king who sits here rules as God's representative over the whole order of creation. And if you understood, as Solomon certainly did, that the dynasty this throne represented had been given by a covenant of salt, sealed by God himself through David. What would you place beneath the point where the king's authority rested? The same substance that made the covenant permanent. The bowl of salt sat beneath Solomon's throne as a covenant declaration made material. Not as magic, not as folk practice, as covenant theology translated into physical form. This is why it worked. Not because salt has inherent mystical properties, because salt represented the legally binding agreement between Solomon's house and the God of Israel. Every time Solomon sat on that throne, he was sitting inside a sealed, active, permanent covenant. And no hostile spiritual force, no witch, no sorcerer, no envious queen with her foreign altars could penetrate what God had legally sealed. Now I want you to sit with the number. 40 years. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 42. Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel 40 years. Not 39, not 41. The protection held for exactly as long as Solomon held the covenant. Not 1 year more, not 1 year less. I find this precise in a way that, frankly, unsettles me a little even now. Because it is not the kind of precision that happens by accident. The seal held exactly as long as the covenant keeper remained inside the covenant. The wall did not collapse under external pressure. It did not corrode from the outside. It was vacated from within. And this is where I need to take you somewhere that this video has been building toward since the beginning. This is the part of tonight's conversation I have been approaching carefully, because I think it matters more than the bowl itself. 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 1 through 13. King Solomon, however, loved many foreign women, besides Pharaoh's daughter, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites. They were from nations about which the Lord had told the Israelites, "You must not intermarry with them, because they will surely turn your hearts after their gods." Nevertheless, Solomon held fast to them in love. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and his wives led his heart astray. I've read that passage perhaps 50 times. I still stop at 700. But it wasn't the number, and it wasn't the women. As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. His heart was not fully devoted. That phrase is the sound of a covenant being left half open. Not canceled, not formally renounced, just not fully inhabited. 1 foot inside, 1 foot elsewhere. The covenant was still there. The bowl was still beneath the throne. The salt was still salt. But the man who was supposed to be living inside the covenant had drifted to the margins of it. And God responded immediately. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 9. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Twice. The text makes sure you remember that. Not once. Twice. No other king in Israel's history received a personal appearance from God twice, and still Solomon allowed his heart to divide. Within the same chapter, 3 enemies arose simultaneously. Hadad the Edomite, who had been living in Egypt, waiting; Rezin of Damascus, who had been an adversary throughout Solomon's reign, but had been contained; and Jeroboam, a man from within Solomon's own administration, raised up against him. 3 enemies, 3 different directions. 1 chapter, as if they had been circling the perimeter for 40 years, unable to enter. And then suddenly, the perimeter was open. The witches didn't break in. The foreign queens didn't break in. Solomon opened the door himself from the inside. The salt didn't fail. The covenant keeper stopped maintaining the covenant. And I want to say this as plainly as I can for those of you who have placed your trust in protection rituals while allowing covenant fidelity to erode quietly in the background. The bowl matters, but the bowl is a consequence of the covenant, not the source of it. A bowl of salt in a house where the inhabitant has abandoned covenant faithfulness is not Solomon's throne. It is just a bowl. Let me tell you something I have never spoken about on this channel before. Nsukka, Nigeria. The house where I grew up. Near the main door, on the inside of the house, not the outside, there was a small clay pot. Low and wide. Dark from years of use. The kind my mother kept for things that mattered, not for ordinary storage. It held rock salt. Plain, unprocessed rock salt. Nothing added to it. Nothing written on it. On the first day of every month, my mother would remove the old salt, take it to the garden, and return it to the earth, and pour fresh salt into the pot. I asked her once, when I was perhaps 12 or 13, what the pot was for. She looked at me with the particular expression that Igbo mothers use when they are deciding how much to explain and how much to simply require you to trust. And she said, "It holds the house." That was everything she said. It holds the house. I did not understand it. My father, who held a chair in ancient religious history at UCL, and who had very gently trained me to regard my mother's practices as culturally significant but pre-scientific, had given me a framework that kept me at arm's length from what my mother was doing. I thought of it as ritual, tradition, something old that had lost its reason along the way. It took me until my early 50s, standing in room 9 of the British Museum looking at the photograph of foundation deposits beneath an Assyrian throne, to understand. My mother was not doing superstition. She was maintaining a covenant. A covenant she had received from her mother, who had received it from hers, all the way back through an unbroken chain of Igbo women who understood something about salt and thresholds and authority and protection that every Western academic framework I had been given had failed to name. And on the first day of every month, she was saying, without these exact words, but with this exact meaning, I am still in this. This house is still held. The house held. Through every difficulty, through every pressure, through every time something external attempted to enter what she had sealed. The house held. She was not doing something unusual. In Yoruba tradition, salt placed on an ancestor altar represents purity and forms a barrier. Nothing of a hostile spiritual nature can cross that line. Salt on the altar is not a petition. It is not a request for protection. It is a declaration that protection already exists within this boundary. In a Khan tradition, among the people of Ghana, salt placed beneath the bed absorbs hostile energy, psychic attack, the unsettled, oppressive, nighttime intrusions that come from outside the household. The salt draws them down and neutralizes them before they reach the person at rest. Among the Igbo, in my mother's tradition, salt alongside alligator pepper and palm oil is used to ward off what they call uchu, negative energy, spiritual pollution, placed at thresholds, beneath sleeping spaces, beneath the seats where household authority rests, beneath the seat of authority. These traditions did not arise from reading 2nd Chronicles. They were not copied from Hebrew manuscripts. There is no documented borrowing. They arose because multiple peoples, in different times and different geographies, encountered the same spiritual reality and landed on the same answer: salt, beneath the seat of authority, renewed regularly, not as a charm, as a living declaration of covenant protection. The British Museum photograph, my mother's clay pot, Solomon's bowl beneath the throne. 3 witnesses to the same principle. Now I want to give you the protocol, not as a ritual divorced from its source, but as a covenant action rooted in the exact biblical theology we have just walked through together. Because Solomon's salt did not work simply because it was salt. It worked because it was a material expression of a living agreement between Solomon and the God who had sealed David's dynasty with a covenant of salt. What you are about to do is not magic. It is not folk practice. It is covenant language. The same legal instrument God used to protect the most powerful throne in the history of Israel for 4 decades. Step 1. Choose your bowl. A small, clean bowl. Ceramic is traditional. Stone, clay, something that comes from the earth. Not plastic, not synthetic. The material matters because it signals intention. Use plain sea salt or rock salt, not iodized table salt. Processed salt has been industrially altered to the point where it has lost its symbolic weight in virtually every tradition that uses it. Unrefined salt is what you want. Salt that is still what salt was before men improved it into something it was never meant to be. Step 2. Speak the covenant aloud. Before you place the bowl, stand with the salt in your hands and declare this, or your own version of it, in your own words, but spoken aloud into the air of the room. Because Ecclesiastes chapter 8 verse 4 says, "Where the word of a king is, there is power." Solomon's authority was always exercised verbally. The declaration must be spoken, not whispered, not thought quietly, spoken. I place this salt as a covenant. As God sealed David's throne with salt, I seal this home. No witch, no familiar spirit, no generational curse can cross what God has sealed. You are not casting a spell. You are making a legal declaration to the spiritual reality of the space around you. There is a difference. Step 3. Place it beneath your authority, under your bed, the place where you are most vulnerable, the throne of your rest, the ground of your recovery each night, or beneath the chair in which you most often sit in your home, your everyday throne, or at the center point of your living room floor, beneath whatever anchors the space. You are choosing the seat of your authority in this household and placing the covenant declaration physically beneath it. This is what the salt under Solomon's throne was. Not floor decoration. Not a lucky charm. A covenant made material, positioned at the exact point where authority sits. Step 4. Renew it monthly. Replace the salt on the first day of each month. Not whenever you remember. Not when it looks dirty. On the first day of the month. This is the detail that changes everything. The covenant was not a one-time act. Solomon's protection held for 40 years because Solomon maintained covenant fidelity for 40 years. The salt is renewed because the covenant is renewed. It is a monthly act of standing in your home with fresh salt in your hands and saying, I am still in this. I have not drifted. This house is still held. The moment it becomes background furniture, the moment you walk past it without thought, without renewal, without intention, you have done exactly what Solomon did in his later years, not violated the covenant dramatically, just allowed it to become nominal. And nominal coverage, as Solomon discovered, is not coverage. Let me bring you back to where we began. 40 years. In 40 years on the throne of Israel, not one curse ever reached Solomon. Not one hostile spiritual force penetrated what God had legally sealed beneath the ivory and gold. Because he sat on a covenant. Because every morning, when he descended those 6 carved steps and settled into the seat of gold, 12 lions watching from either side, he sat down inside an agreement with the God of Israel that salt had made permanent. That agreement was not broken from outside. The enemies who circled could not find a crack in what God himself had sealed. It was abandoned from within. And when it was abandoned, when the heart that had been fully devoted became only partially devoted, when the covenant keeper drifted to the margins of what he was supposed to inhabit, the enemies that had been waiting for 40 years walked through an open door. Your home is your throne. Not because of your income, not because of your address, not because of your status, because God has given authority over that space to you. And covenant language, salt placed beneath your seat of authority with a spoken declaration, renewed on the first of every month, is how you make that authority legally, spiritually explicit. Not as superstition, not as borrowed tradition, not as an experiment, as the same mechanism that protected the most powerful king in the history of Israel for 40 years. Tonight, before you sleep, decide where the seat of your authority is in your home. And begin. I want to leave you with one thought. My mother placed that clay pot of rock salt near our door in Nsuka every single month for as long as I can remember. She was not a mystic. She was not especially dramatic about it. She simply did it on the first day of each month, the way you might pay a bill or change a calendar. Quietly, consistently, with full intention. And when I asked her what it was for, she gave me 2 words. It holds the house. I now have enough manuscript hours, enough years, in enough museums and archives and ancient libraries to translate those 2 words into the language of 2 Chronicles and Leviticus and Numbers and the Assyrian Foundation deposits in Room 9 of the British Museum. She was maintaining a covenant, month after month, year after year, for reasons she understood without needing to explain. And the house held. Ask yourself tonight, what is holding yours? Sleep well. Or perhaps don't.